The 2000s, a time when the world was shifting. Flip phones, MySpace, and the dawn of a new era in technology promised a future of endless possibilities. But for many, the 2000s were also defined by unsolved mysteries and chilling disappearances, cases that slipped through the cracks, haunting the memories of families and investigators alike. College students vanished without a trace. A pregnant wife's murder gripped the nation, while women disappeared along the West Coast, their fates unknown and their stories left unfinished. These are the cold case files, unsolved mysteries of the 2000s, cases that would leave an indelible mark on the collective conscience. It all begins with the case of Maura Murray, a young woman whose disappearance on a snowy New Hampshire road still echoes in the cold winds of mystery. Maura Murray, a 21-year-old nursing student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, was no stranger to stress. She had been struggling emotionally and academically, her life unraveling after a credit card fraud incident that rocked her world. On February 9, 2004, she decided to leave everything behind. She emailed her professors, claiming a family emergency, packed her car, and withdrew $280 from her bank account. She then drove north toward the unknown, a decision that would change everything. By 7:27 p.m., Maura's black satin sedan was found crashed into a snowbank on Route 112 in Haverhill, New Hampshire. A passing bus driver, Butch Atwood, offered his help, but Maura refused. She claimed she had already called AAA, but there was no record of such a call. Atwood drove on, and when police arrived at 7:46 p.m., the car was locked, the airbag deployed, and Maura was gone. Inside the car, they found items that raised more questions than answers. Alcohol, a rag in the tailpipe, and a map with Burlington, Vermont circled. But Maura herself was nowhere to be found. What happened to Maura Murray? Theories flooded in, each one more perplexing than the last. Did she wander into the woods and succumb to the cold, her body hidden somewhere in the unforgiving terrain? Or was something darker at play? Did someone abduct her, taking her away from that desolate road to an unknown fate? Some suggested that Maura, under the weight of her struggles, staged her disappearance, planning to start anew somewhere far from the life she had known. But with no financial activity or contact from her since that night, this theory seemed increasingly unlikely. And then there were the whispers. Theories of a tandem driver, someone who was with Maura that night, perhaps someone she knew. Yet, as with all the other theories, there was no proof, only more questions. Over the years, the Murray family has fought tirelessly to keep Maura's case alive, offering a $40,000 reward and maintaining a website dedicated to finding their daughter. Despite numerous searches by the FBI, New Hampshire State Police, and even amateur sleuths, Maura's disappearance remains a haunting mystery, a case that refuses to be closed. Every new lead, every new clue only adds more layers to the enigma that is Maura Murray. And then there is Laci Peterson, a name that, like Maura's, will forever be tied to the tragedy of an unsolved mystery. On December 24, 2002, Laci Peterson, 8 months pregnant with her son Connor, disappeared from her home in Modesto, California. Her husband, Scott Peterson, reported her missing after she failed to return from walking their dog. What seemed like a simple disappearance soon turned into something far more sinister. Scott claimed he had been fishing at the Berkeley Marina, nearly 90 miles away, but as the investigation unfolded, his alibi began to crumble. In the weeks that followed, the media frenzy surrounding Laci's disappearance reached a fever pitch. The search for Laci was intense, but it was not until April 13, 2003, that the bodies of Laci and her unborn son were discovered washed ashore in San Francisco Bay, just miles from where Scott claimed to have been fishing. The discovery was a devastating blow to Laci's family, But it also raised more questions about Scott Peterson's involvement in his wife's murder. As the investigation continued, more and more inconsistencies in Scott's story emerged. He had been having an affair with Amber Fry, a woman who would later provide key testimony against him. Scott's lack of emotional response, his erratic behavior, and his sudden confession to Amber that he was living a double life painted a picture of a man with something to hide. He was arrested in April 2003, and in 2004, he was convicted of first-degree murder for Laci's death and second-degree murder for Connor's. Sentenced to death, Scott's conviction would later be overturned, and his sentence was reduced to life without parole in 2020, though questions still linger about his guilt. Laci Peterson's case was a national tragedy, one that consumed the media and the public alike. It highlighted the complexities of domestic violence, the secrets that can be hidden behind closed doors, and the devastation that can be caused by a betrayal that runs so deep. The case still remains a point of division, with some continuing to believe in Scott's innocence and others convinced of his guilt. But one thing remains certain: Laci Peterson's death was a loss that reverberated across the nation, leaving a hole in the hearts of those who loved her. Then there is the chilling pattern of disappearances along the West Coast, cases that span decades and raise terrifying questions. Women, often young, often alone, vanishing without a trace. Tara Calico, a 19-year-old cyclist from New Mexico, vanished in 1988. Her disappearance becoming one of the most haunting unsolved cases of the 2000s. In 2008, a Polaroid resurfaced showing a bound woman, with many speculating that it was Tara, though the identity was never confirmed. Kristin Smart, a college student from California, vanished in 1996. Despite years of investigation, it wasn't until 2022 that Paul Flores was convicted of her murder, thanks to new evidence. And then there's Brittany Drexel, a 17-year-old from Myrtle Beach who vanished in 2009. For years, her case remained unsolved until 2022, when Raymond Moody confessed to her murder. These cases, among others, have led many to believe that a serial killer may be responsible, possibly linked to truckers or drifters who prey on young women traveling alone. But the evidence remains elusive, and the terror that these disappearances instilled in communities along the West Coast is undeniable. In these unsolved cases, the families are left with nothing but the pain of not knowing what happened to their loved ones. And the haunting question remains: who is responsible for these disappearances, and will they ever be brought to justice? As the years passed, the cases of Maura Murray and Laci Peterson continued to captivate the public, their stories becoming part of a larger narrative of unsolved mysteries that lingered in the air like a shadow. But while these high-profile cases garnered attention, there were many others that remained unresolved, each with its own heartbreaking story and haunting questions that refused to fade into the background. One such case is that of Kristin Smart, a young woman whose disappearance in 1996 would haunt her family for decades. Kristin, a college student at California Polytechnic State University, was last seen walking home from a party on the evening of May 25, 1996. She never made it back to her dorm. Her disappearance sparked one of the most extensive search efforts in California's history, but despite years of investigation, the case remained unsolved. As time went on, the leads dried up, and the hope of finding Kristin alive began to fade. However, the case was never truly closed. Her family fought relentlessly to keep her name in the public eye, knowing that the key to her disappearance lay buried somewhere, waiting to be uncovered. It wasn't until 2022 that a breakthrough finally came. Paul Flores, a fellow student who had been the last person seen with Kristin, was arrested and charged with her murder. The arrest was based on new evidence, including DNA analysis and testimonies that had been ignored or dismissed in the early years of the investigation. For over 2 decades, Kristin's family had held on to the hope that the truth would come to light, and in 2022, that hope was realized. Paul Flores was convicted of her murder, bringing a sense of justice to the Smart family. But for many, the question remained, how many other cases like Kristin's had slipped through the cracks? The 2000s were a decade of technological advances, but the criminal justice system was often slow to adapt. DNA testing, once a groundbreaking tool, was now becoming more sophisticated, and forensic science was evolving in ways that would eventually solve some of the coldest cases. Yet, despite these advances, many families were still left with nothing but unanswered questions. Social media, which had become a double-edged sword in criminal investigations, allowed people to rally behind their loved ones' cases, but it also fueled misinformation, making it harder to separate fact from fiction. And for every cold case that was solved, there were countless others that remained frozen in time, their mysteries lingering like a dark cloud over the families and communities that would never forget them. One of the most chilling trends of the 2000s was the string of disappearances of young women along the West Coast. From 2000 to 2009, several women vanished without a trace, their cases often linked by geography, victim profile, and the eerie similarities between their fates. Tara Calico, a 19-year-old cyclist from New Mexico, disappeared in 1988, but her case continued to haunt investigators in the 2000s. A 2008 Polaroid surfaced showing a bound woman who many believed to be Tara, but despite extensive efforts to identify her, the truth remained elusive. Was Tara Calico the victim of a serial killer? Was this Polaroid the key to solving the case, or was it just another false lead? The questions piled up, but the answers remained just out of reach. Then there was Rachel Cook, a 19-year-old jogger from Texas who vanished in 2002. Her case, like so many others, grew cold as the years passed. Despite efforts from the FBI and local law enforcement, Rachel's body was never found, and no suspects were ever identified. The case remained a tragic reminder of how easily someone could disappear without a trace, leaving nothing but sorrow and confusion in their wake. And while investigators were left to piece together fragments of the past, the families of these missing women were left to wonder. What really happened to their daughters, their sisters, their friends? The disappearances along the West Coast weren't just statistics, they were real people, each with a story, a life cut short, a family left behind. Many believed these cases were linked by a common thread, a pattern that pointed to a serial killer operating along the highways. The FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative suggested that truckers or drifters may have been responsible for a series of disappearances, with over 850 unsolved murders along the nation's highways. But as with many cold cases, no definitive proof could be found to connect these disappearances to one specific killer. The idea of a serial killer lurking in the shadows, picking off vulnerable women one by one, was a terrifying thought. But the evidence was too thin to make a conclusive case. Despite this, the families of the missing women refused to give up hope. They fought for answers, worked with investigators, and pushed for justice, knowing that the search for the truth could never end. Some cases, like that of Brittany Drexel, a 17-year-old who vanished from Myrtle Beach in 2009, would eventually see a resolution. In 2022, Raymond Moody confessed to her murder, bringing closure to a case that had haunted her family for over a decade. But for many others, the fight continues. Even as DNA testing and genetic genealogy continue to evolve, offering hope in cases where it once seemed impossible to find answers, there are still countless families left without closure. The 2000s were a time of both technological breakthroughs and heartbreaking stagnation. As cases like Kristin Smart's and Maura Murray's remained open, their fates still shrouded in mystery. And as we look to the future, one question remains: How many more cold cases are waiting to be solved, their stories waiting to be heard? The story of these cold cases is not just about the crimes themselves, it is about the families left behind, the communities forever marked by the loss of their loved ones, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Some cases, like that of Maura Murray, continue to elude investigators, but the search for answers never stops. It is a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the past, there is always a glimmer of hope, that the truth will eventually emerge, no matter how long it takes. And so the search continues. For every case that remains unsolved, there are countless others that demand justice. The families of the missing, the murdered and the forgotten continue to fight, to search, and to hope that one day their loved ones' stories will be told. For some, that day will come sooner rather than later, but for others, the wait is interminable. The cold case files of the 2000s are far from closed, and as long as there are questions left unanswered, the pursuit of truth will never cease.